So I'm here in Sydney, and you can see behind me is obviously the Sydney Opera House. When you start to think about the Sydney Opera House, what do you think about? Well, for Australians, obviously this is Sydney, represents Sydney. If you're outside of Australia, this represents Australia, and it's an icon, it's a symbol, and the symbol means something, and the symbol stands for something. It stands for everything that it represents. And that's exactly what happens when it comes to brands or icons. And if you think about your business or about yourself, you are a brand, you're an icon, you are something, you symbolize what it means. So when you think about, when you see this image right here, anywhere around the world, they think of not just Australia, but what Australia represents. Now, the thing is that with everything that's going on right now, is that there's a couple of things you need to consider. There's three ways to kind of really tackle your brand and to really change the image or the perception of it. Now, some of it you can change, some of you can influence it, but not everything's always in your control. So let me give you an example. Number one is that when it comes to brand identity, your identity is basically, number one, is that what you want the world to perceive it to be. Well, the problem is that sometimes what you want the world to perceive it to be doesn't necessarily what other perceives, how you perceive it. So for example, Australia obviously wants to be perceived as an amazing free country, you know, sunshine and beaches and, you know, just a place where people want to visit. And part of it's true, right? I've been in Australia for 20 years now, and being a Canadian, it represents all of that. And that's obviously what Australia as a country wants to represent. But, however, that's only one part of the picture. Because just because you want that doesn't necessarily that's how everybody perceives it. You see, there's a second component. The second component is what others perceive of you. Now, what others perceive of you is not really necessarily in your control, because the first one, what's in control is what you project out. But sometimes what others perceive is actually what they see. And so in the world right now, the world sees Australia over the last couple of years to be a certain way. And they will perceive it to have certain functions. Meaning that Australia right now represents, well, whatever the world represents. I've seen the world news, I've spoken to a lot of friends outside of Australia, and guess what? They see Australia very, very differently than what Australia wants people to think we are. And I think it's really important distinction here. I'm not going to get into politics, I'm not even going to get into what that represents, but I think you all know what we're talking about. We're right now filming this in January 2022, and you can know understanding with certain tennis stars right now, or certain things, what's been happening over the last 2 years with, you know, lockdown in Sydney for the last 6 months. All of those things represent certain things, and that's how the public or outside people perceive Sydney. Well, why does that matter? Well, that's something you can't control. You can only control the first aspect, which is what you want the world to perceive. But the world will see you, not necessarily what you want to perceive, but basically on your actions. And this is what comes down to the third thing. The third thing actually comes down to is how you act and behave. Because your action, your behaviors is something you can control. That's something that you are really going to be measured by, because, you know, Australia for hundreds of years have been perceived to be a certain way, and just in 1 year, I believe, can change the perception of what Australia's like. Now, can it switch around? Can it change? Maybe. But all I'm saying is that you got to start thinking about is in your brand, your identity and who you are may have been represented in a certain way for such a long time, and you might have created that icon, like, you know, and how people perceive you. But if your actions change or your actions don't continue to be consistent, no matter what the narrative on the outside is, guess what? It's going to start shifting. And so I think it's really important when it comes to brand identity and your identity and how you want to be represented in your community is, number one, is you got to decide, number one, is what do you want the world to perceive you as, and you need to act accordingly. Number two is that, you know, you got to really start to influence the people of the outside world and how they see you. So that could come in terms of how you are making sure that your actions and behaviors are aligned with everything you want the world to see you as. If they're not, guess what? The world is going to win, and the world's perception of you is going to think what they're going to think. And if it's different, if your actions are different to what you want it to perceive, then the world's going to perceive you, your brand, your company, your practice to be a certain way, and you can't change any of that. And it's going to be frustrating, but it all comes down to focusing on the things you can change, which is your actions, your behaviors, which is what you do consistently that is aligned to your values. So all of this comes down to what? Number one is you got to have a vision of what you want to have. Number two, you have to have a values that you stand by and you stick to it. And number three, you got to act accordingly. If you don't do so, guess what? You will be perceived considerably different than how you want to perceive. But that's not, you can't blame others. You only can have really fault your own. So focus on the things you control. Remember, your brand, your icon, your logo is just the shortcut to everything that shortcut represents. This is a shortcut that represents what Australia represents in its values. So your brand is just like this, which is focusing on, it basically shortcuts everything that you represent. So make sure that how you're being perceived into the world and the community is what you want it to be. If not, start making some changes.